Hi everyone, hope you are doing well. In this video, we are going to set up login with Google in our e-commerce platform. This particular video is a part of a series called as Software Engineering Bootcamp, and as a part of that series, in this particular video, we'll set up login. At the end of the video, things will look something like this on Azure. So we'll have something like login with Google if you are not logged in. So for example, if you go to your home page, you will be redirected to login. When you click on sign in with Google, you will be redirected to a sign in page. When you click on your email ID, you will be redirected back and you will see something like this. That's the home page of your website. So that's how the things will look like at the end of the video. In your backend system, what will happen is that you will have something like this, the static method session data holder. And whenever in your controller you want to get information about the user who has made the call, what you need to do is almost nothing. Basically, you just make a call to session data holder dot get session data, and it will give you all the data related to the customer who has made the call. It will fetch the data from the cookie, it will fetch the data from the session objects. So we'll talk all about those things in detail, but this is what you will get at the end of the video, where you'll have a backend system. You will have a static method. You can just call the static method to get the logged in user. So if you see this get session data, it's a static method. So you can get that information from the backend. And in the front end, you will have the logged in user. You can reload as many times you want, and you will have the login at the end. And eventually at the end, what I'll do is that I'll have something on Azure. So we already have our code base on Azure. So here what we'll do is that we'll set up the login with Google on Azure as well. So as of now, if you see, no login with Google is needed. This is my service which is running on Azure, and as of now no login with Google is needed, but by the end of the video we'll integrate it here as well. So let's quickly get started. Now let's talk about the things which we are going to configure. The first thing is that we'll set up Google Cloud. So we'll go to console.google.cloud.google.com, and there we'll set up the authentication, basically the client ID on the Google Cloud. Then we'll do a bunch of other things, like we'll generate the UI code to login, basically the login button which you saw. Then we'll go to Maven and we'll set up the backend systems for us. So there we'll configure Maven. We'll configure a bunch of things related to Spring Boot, and eventually we'll set up the HTML as well. So Google Cloud, then the backend, and then the front end. So these are the things we are going to configure. If I give you the overall overview, these are the things at a very high level we are going to configure. We'll have the Google Cloud setup, and then we'll have the backend setup on various things like Maven dependency, login controller, authentication filter. We'll talk about all these things in detail one by one. So let's go to the browser and set up these things one by one. So the first thing, as we talked about, is setting up the login with Google thing. So for that, I would recommend, in this video, I'll not get into a lot of detail of logging in with Google because I already have a video of around 30 minutes on logging in with Google, right? So you can go ahead and check out everything I have set up, how to set up, login with Google, and then I have also set up the GitHub link. You can check out that as well. So people can go ahead and check out the sample code. So here is a sample code for the same thing, which is configured. So those things are configured. This is the repository, and where I have explained the things in detail, but here I'll just touch upon the things. So the first thing you need to do when you configure login with Google is to go to this console.cloud.google.com. So this is the place where you need to go and configure your login with Google. I know that in the previous video I have been setting up things on Azure, but when you are setting up login with Google, it is easier to set up on Google Cloud compared to going to the Azure. And I think even there you might have to still touch upon the console.cloud.google.com because the client ID would still exist in the Google Cloud. So I checked multiple ways of setting up Google, login with Google, and I think this is the only way. And maybe if there is other way, I'm not sure, but this is the way which is easier and which gets, which is more popular. So basically, if you go to this console.cloud.google.com, you can set up your own account here. and you can actually create your own project as well. So I have a few projects on my name. I can create a new project also if I want to, and I can name it anything, and then I can click on create. I will not do that now. It's very simple to create a project. So once you create a project, you will have this particular UI in front of you, and in this UI you need to click on these three lines and then go to the APIs and services and then go to the credentials option. So this is the page you will land into. Now here you need to create an OAuth 2.0 client ID. So for that you can click on create credentials and you click on this OAuth client ID, and this new page will open. Let's just wait for it to get created. Here you need to choose web application. All these things are being talked about in the other video. And here you need to set up the origin. The origins which we need to set up is local host. If you're working on local host, you have to set up to HTTP localhost 8080. So my services run on localhost 8080. So both of these things need to be configured. Likewise, the redirection URL also needs to have two things. Later we'll add the Azure URL as well, but for now we are starting with localhost. So we'll set up these things. Localhost 8080. So these things can be configured here, and then you just click on create. So when you click on create, you will get a client ID and client secret. This is the client ID which you can copy, and this is what will be needed in the upcoming screens. Since I have already created another client ID, here you see my client ID. Since I have already one client ID with me, so I'm not going to modify anything, or I'm not going to use the new client ID. I'll use this client ID itself. I don't need client secret for this flow anyway. So this is how you can create a client ID for your web application, which will be needed in the other videos, other sections. Now there is a second step to it. Once you have the client ID, then you would need the client ID to generate the UI code. So we'll go here, and in this particular developers, this link is mentioned in my Google Cloud credentials page. So here when you click on this Google Cloud credential, this Google Doc fundamentals, when you click on this particular page, you will land this website of developers.googlecloud.com, and here you will have something called as generate integration code. And here you can actually put the client ID which was generated. So you go here, you copy the client ID. The client ID is needed. So we'll copy the client ID from here. And then we'll go back and paste the client ID here. Then the login URL, basically there is one more thing, that whenever you log in, you need a callback to your backend system. I'll talk about the callback, but for now, let's just set up localhost 8:8080 slash login slash callback. So this is the controller which you need to implement in your backend system, so that what happens is that the moment you log in, the redirection happens to your backend machine. So you need to create a controller for this one. So it's a pretty standard controller, but that's what you need to do. Click on this, and we don't need one tap login. One tap login I have explained in my YouTube video how to do that. You can check out the video. I'll link two different videos related to both the videos are of around 25 to 30 minutes. You can check out how to have a one tap login as well. So I'll not set up that flow here. Let me come back here. I'll just have a login with Google button, and then I'll do a get code. So I'll get the code something like this, which I need to paste in my backend system. So we'll come back to the code here later in the later part of the video. But before that, let me show you the thing. So basically we have done the generate Google client ID, and we have also done the UI code generation from Google Cloud. So these two things are done. Now we'll go to the backend code setup, and we'll set up one by one these stuffs: Maven dependency, login controller, authentication filter, and request context folder. So let me go to my IntelliJ IDE. So this is the IntelliJ IDE where I have been setting up things. If you have watched my previous video, you would have seen that the files which are not read are the files which were there before this particular video. But in this video, I didn't want you to waste a lot of time in setting these files. So what I'll do is that I'll walk you through the files. And anyway, you have my code base link. I'll put the code link in my description. So anyway, you can go ahead and check out the code. So that should not be the problem anyway, right? So if you see here, in the last video, the only thing I had was a health check. So that whatever request comes to you, you can do a health check. That's it. Here I have added bunch of new things. The first is the home controller. This is nothing but the home page. So if I can go to my this website, so this controller gets hit, home controller, where I have a static object and I get the data. So the first thing which I would need to do is to set up my Maven, that is the pom.xml, and here I have set up two new things. Everything else was there in the previous video, that is setting up a REST API on Java Spring Based project. There are two things I have added, two Maven dependencies. The first is the Spring Boot Thymeleaf dependency. What it does is that when you add this is helpful for setting up the static content, basically the content which you can serve from the server. So server side HTML pages can be set using this particular dependency. So when you set this in the resources folder, you can create a templates folder, and within templates folder, whatever HTML files you put, those HTML files can be returned from the controller, which means that if I have something like pom.xml, and within pom.xml, if I have this dependency, so what exactly I can do is that I can open my controller, and in my controller, if I have this controller and get mapping, something like this. So there are two types of controller. If you see, one is the REST controller, which returns the normal string, and then there is another one which is controller. When you have just the controller, in those cases, when you return this home, so it will search for this home.html and whatever values this model object has. So model object is set up by default. You don't have to do anything. You just write a controller @controller and @get mapping. And here what you can do is that this model will be there by default. You just write a model object and you add these attributes. You don't even have to return the model object. Spring takes care of those things. So these values, user ID, email, these things get set up in the home.html. So if you go to home.html, user ID, email, so whatever things you set up in the model object, those get set up here in this HTML. So it's server side rendering where the server returns the plain HTML object, HTML page to the UI. So this is one thing which is configured, that is home.html, and that is done using the Thymeleaf. Likewise, I have a login UI.html where the login UI, the UI which we were talking about earlier, right? Which was generated by Google. Here, generate HTML. So this particular UI is the one which I have copied and I pasted it here. There is only one variable, just like the previous one I added. This callback URL is different. It's not exactly localhost because I want it to be a variable base so that when I deploy it elsewhere, so it can take the, instead of localhost, it could be something else. So if you go to this login controller and you go to this, we already talked about the home controller, but if you go to the login controller, that's what I am doing. I am trying to get the base URL. So for base URL, this is the way you get the base URL of your website. You can search internet how this works, and you don't even have to understand a lot about it. So here you get the base URL, and in the callback URL, I am just doing a base URL plus login plus callback, so that whenever a login happens, whenever a successful login happens, we will get a post call on this endpoint. So we are just telling the Google that, hey, whenever a successful login happens, you can make a callback to this URL so that I can do some validations and I can do a redirection. So those things can be configured here. Also, there is one more thing which I wanted to show in the login UI is that this code is, although this code is copied from the Google's page here, but there are two other things which you need to import and use, which is script. So this script src is a Google client, Google JavaScript client, which is needed in your HTML page. If you don't have this, then the problem is nothing will work. So you need this script src equal to Google client so that these things actually make sense. Otherwise, how will a simple HTML page understand what is data type, what is data shape? Lot of things it won't understand. What is this class? So this particular JavaScript makes it possible to render a proper login button, right? Something like this. So that's why it makes sense. So coming back to the login page, here when the successful login happens, when the redirection happens, so there are a bunch of validations which you can then, you can validate the cookie, that is the CSRF, that is cross-site request forgery is done or not. Then you can verify the ID token. So if I can show you the verification, then I'm using the Google library. So that is the second dependency here, that is the Google API client library. So this is the library which you need to import in your project. And the only reason you need to import is this session service. That's why you need the Google client library, is that when you get a credential as a callback. So when you get a callback from the redirection, you can send this credential to the verify object, and then the Google client will verify it, that whether your credential is correct or not. So you don't have to worry about verifying the credential. The redirection will make sure about the the validation of the token. So those things can also be taken care by this Google Google client. So the redirection will happen, and once the redirection happens, you do a validate query, and then you firstly you validate the cookie, and then you validate the token. So you validate the credential which you get from the callback URL. So here you see you are getting in the request param, you get credential, and here all we are doing in the post mapping is to verify it. So these are the standard thing which is needed if you are building the login with Google Flow. There is anyway the detailed video which you can see and understand. And here the thing which we are adding is that when we verify that the credentials are correct, so from the that credential object itself, we can get bunch of things. So this let's go to this one, get session data. So this ID token is something which this Google library returns to us, and then using this login details, the Google ID token returned by Google, we get bunch of information from Google itself, like name, picture, locale, family name. So these information comes as a callback to us. So we can set those information in a static object. So that's the second thing we do, that we set up the things in the static object. So these are the two libraries which we import. The one is the Thymeleaf and the other is Google API client. Nothing else. The plugin was there before itself. It was as a part of a Spring initializer project. We are not adding anything here. So these two Maven dependencies, the POM dependencies got added. And we already talked about the login controller. So /login returns the login page to the UI, and the /login/callback method is a post call. And that's what we do. This call is made from the front end after the redirection is successful, and a session ID is assigned and set in the browser if the if the details are correct. So for that, let me show you how that happens. So here in the session service, again, we have set up the session data object. Here you see we have got the session data, and what exactly we are doing with the session data is that we are adding that session data to the cookie and cache. So what we do is that we have set up a session ID cookie in the browser, that is e-commerce -session ID in the browser, and that session ID we are setting in the browser, and we are setting the same thing in our backend. So we have something called a session cache, which is nothing but a hash map. The key is a session ID and the value is session data. so that when a new request comes to us from the front end, so we'll check the cookie, and in the cookie we'll check the session ID. So those things also we can verify. There is other thing as well, that is authentication failures. So those things we configure with the help of authentication filter. So let me show you what exactly is the filter so that you can understand. So here, if you go and you check this authentication filter, so you can read more about what exactly is filter, but at a high level, filter means that whatever request comes to your controller, all the requests will go via the filter. So to create any filter in Spring, you just write @component, and order one means that if there are multiple filter, which filter you want to run first, and you just do implements filter. So all the requests will go via filter. So here I'm just having a logic that all the requests will check will be here. What I'll do is that all the requests which are were is coming to my controller, if the request are slash login and slash login callback, then I'll not verify the credentials. In other cases, I'll verify the credential, that whether the session ID is valid or not, and if they are invalid, I'll redirect them to the login page. So that's what I'm doing in the authentication filter. Let me show you a little more about it in this particular place. So you can read more about this. Basically, uh, what is handler and what is filter. So basically, the filters run very much before the dispatcher servlets, basically very much before the request goes to the controller. So all the authentication related stuffs are implemented in the filters. Then there is something called as interceptor. The thing is, interceptors are even closer to the backend systems, so they are handled for other use cases. You can read about that in this particular URL, but the thing is, for authentication, the filters are set up. Now let's check more of the things. So we have checked the authentication filters, we have checked the login controller, Maven dependencies, and the second is the setting the request context holder. So this is something given by Spring itself. So whatever request comes to us in the filter, we are setting the things in this session holder class. So session holder class is nothing but a static class, and here we are using something called as request context holder. This is something which is given to us by Spring. So here what we do is that we just set the session data in this request context folder. It's a static method, but it takes care of the thing that since it's static method, it's easier to access the logged in user information from anywhere within the code. So we are just doing a request context folder dot set attribute, and you are setting the value. Basically, we are setting the session data, we are clearing the session data. So those things we are doing here, and here in the login controller we are just calling the static method. So we don't have to every time worry about the function, the dependency injection, and making sure that the object is there in the constructor. Just the static method, you can call it and use it. So yeah, these things are configured end to end. Now what I can do is that I can run the code. Let me stop this particular process and run it again for you. You see, my Spring project is now running. Now let me go to browser and open the local host. So I was logged in earlier, but since I restarted my server, and as of my session IDs were there just in a hash map, so they would get lost anyway. So I'm just doing a reload. So I have to set up the login with Google. Let me do one thing. Let me open Chrome. If I open Chrome, it will be easy for you to visualize as well. And let me open the developer tools. Let's run this. You see, I tried to access the local host, but it redirected me to the login page. That's the first thing which it did. That, hey, let's redirect you to the login page. And these are nothing but the Google based stuff. And here you see that we have the HTML returned by the server directly. So we made the call to slash login, and the server returned me the HTML page with the data login URL equal to this. whereas in my backend it was dollar data callback URL, right? Now I'll click on sign in with Google. Let's clear this thing, right? So that it makes more sense for us. So in this sign in with Google, I'll do the sign in, and you see uh, redirect happened to this slash callback URL. So that's why you would need to implement the post call for this callback URL. And when the call was made, so there were a bunch of cookies which get set up. So one of the cookies which the backend had set is this e-commerce session ID. Now what will happen is that in the further calls, this session ID will be sent. So once this redirection happened, the redirection happened to the home page here. You see, so basically the first thing is that this callback happened, and in the request header, this particular data went right, and in the response was redirect anyway. So here the response, the for the local host, we got all the data, the plain HTML we got from the server. And here you see that the local host referrer was this slash login, and the cookie value here e-commerce session ID. So with the help of this session ID, whenever the request goes to the backend has saved that for this session ID, what user has logged in, it's in the hash map. So user will actually get the cookie. This cookie goes in all the requests, so the backend will be able to figure out what is going on. So that's why the login is happening successfully in the login page. Now in the further reloads, the same thing will happen, that the local host is making call, and the backend is actually able to figure out the session ID in the request header, basically in the cookie, and then it is able to verify that is there a valid user which exists or not. That's why when you stop the service, the session ID will be lost, and then you have to log in again. In the real world environment, these session IDs are stored in some external storage like Redis. In that way, what will happen is that even if we restart the server, your sessions will not expire. So there is a whole theory around it. What I'll do, I'll have a separate video on the session invalidation, but for now I think it makes sense that things are working for us. So now let me go ahead and commit this code to the server, so that we can actually deploy the same thing to Azure and see the changes. So let me go to my IntelliJ IDE. I'll stop my things here, and I'll open the terminal. Let's open the terminal here. Get status. So currently, I think we are in the main branch. I'll do git branch, and I'll do something like login with Google. And then I'll do git checkout login with Google. So right now I'm in the branch called as login with Google. Okay, I can do git status, and I have these many files to commit. So I'll do is git add pom.xml. Then I'll add all these files. Let's do one thing. Let's do git add star.java. Let's see if that works to add all the .java files. Okay, does not happen. So we'll have to add all the files manually. Copy. So after adding all the files which I need to add, I'll do a git commit. And then what I can do is that if I do git status, you will not see any file. Then I'll do git push origin head. So it will be pushed to my branch. I think I need to add the username. Let me set up the login with the GitHub in my system. Or let me do one thing. Let me go to GitHub desktop and set up the GitHub desktop. So I'll go to GitHub desktop download will be easier for now. We'll download this GitHub desktop. So how to set up things in Windows, we have already seen in the previous video, how to set up Git in Windows. For this one, I wanted to have a simpler stuff. So, or a little different to be precise. So we have this GitHub desktop. We'll open it and install it in our machine. We just need to copy it, go to applications and paste it. Here we are setting up things on for Windows, you have already seen. For Mac, we are setting up the things. We'll go to GitHub desktop. We'll do the sign in with github.com and it will do the sign in. I'll just do finish. Then I'll do existing repository. So we'll go to that. So here you see, I have already a bunch of changes there. Then I'll do is publish the branch and it will push the changes to Git. Now I'll go to github.com. Let's open the one in my other browser. And here I have my repository. I'll go to my e-commerce backend stuff where I have pushed my changes. So I have pushed my changes to login with Google. I'll create my pull request to the main branch because I have configured everything to my main branch. You see the changes here. So I have added the libraries here. I have added a controller here. I have added one is a login controller, other is a callback controller. Then this is the auth constant. I just wanted to have some constants here. I added that here. This is the filter which I added. And then I have session data which I have added. Likewise, session data holder and the session cache. So, and the session service eventually. This is the front end code which was added. So all these things are added here. I'll just do a click on create pull request. So my pull request is created. Then I'll do a merge pull request so that my changes will be merged. Confirm the merge. So my changes are now merged. What will happen now? Let's go to my e-commerce backend code base, and here the changes will now be triggered to be deployed to Azure. So if you go to Azure, I have already configured the CI/CD pipeline in my previous video. So that's what will happen here. I'll just reload everything now and things should be deployed now into Azure. So it will take some time for the deployment to finish, and then we will see the deployment to be finished and this page working. There is one thing I would need to configure is here in my client, I would need to add the URL for my this website. So basically, if I come here, I should be able to access. So here, if you see e-commerce backend, and I'll add the same thing here as well. And I'll do save so that the redirection should happen properly. Otherwise, it will say that, hey, this URL, I don't recognize this URL. So I have added the URL so that it could easily be recognized. So you see now the URL, the save operation is done. It will take 5 minutes to a few hours for it to reflect. So we can wait. But meanwhile, we'll wait for the deployment to succeed. So you see, it's in progress. Once the deployment gets finished, then we should be able to see the login with Google stuff happening on our Azure portal as well. It took around 2 minutes for the deployment to finish. Now, if we go here and we can actually try to open the page, so we'll be redirected to the sign in with Google. When I click on sign in with Google, it will be redirected to my this Google login stuff. And when I click OK, let's just wait to see if the login works or not. So you see the login works. So I am able to do a login with Google in my website as well. And not just the login with Google, I'm also able to change my things in the backend. So here in the backend, I'll be able to get the logged in user data to set up everything. So yeah, I think I was helpful for you in setting up the login with Google in your backend website. And whatever we have talked till now, it's the general framework which is needed. We have not even gone into the problem statement yet. That's what will be the APIs and what will be the various databases. But this is the basic structure, right? You need login in your backend system. You need, let's say, a database. So you need, but or you need logging. You need some logging so that the logs could flow. So there are a bunch of things you need anyway. So this is the basic framework. We are still working on the basic framework. Once this basic framework works, then we will move ahead and talk about the problem is specific to the subject. But till now, we are just talking about the basic backend stuff. So that once this basic backend stuff of the pipeline, the logging, the login with Google, all those things work, then we'll talk about more more things specific to the problem statement. So yeah, that's it from my side for this video. I hope this video was helpful. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you really like it. It really makes a difference. Till the next time, bye.